All right, welcome back. We are starting chapter 8, the senses. So, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the special senses. And as you can see here, those special senses include smell, taste, sight, hearing, equilibrium. Now, normally when we talk about our senses, you're going to think about things like the five senses, as our little guy here has. He has his hearing, smell, sight, taste, and touch. And you'll notice that touch is the one that's actually missing from this list. I left you a little space on your notes where it has letter F for number 1. You can go ahead and write touch there. But touch is not actually considered a special sense. The reasoning for this is simply because it's something that's done practically all over our body, and it's what we consider more of a general sense. These general senses include not just touch, but touch kind of overlaps with things like our ability to sense temperature change, whether you're hot or cold in a room, our abilities to sense pressure or even pain. That soreness you feel in your muscles, that's a sense that's specific to touch. And so these are what we call our general senses. So things like smelling, tasting, seeing, these are what we consider special. And there's a specific reason why we do this. Go ahead for a second. I just want you to take a minute and think, what do all these senses have in common? Equilibrium might be the hard one to kind of figure out here. But what do you think they all have in common? All right. Uh, if you haven't noticed, where do we see from? Our eyes. Where do we taste from? Our mouth. What about smelling? Our nose. Hearing? It's in our ears. And even equilibrium, our ability to balance. We just talked about how that's found in the cerebellum. That's where that's going on. But equilibrium is actually happening within our ears. And as we get further in this chapter, we're going to talk about that more. But all these places that I've mentioned, where are they found? Your eyes, your nose, your mouth. They're found on your face, on your head. And a lot of times, scientists, when they're trying to classify certain organisms or other things, they look to where all these sense organs are, these senses are being processed if the organism has them. And that's generally what they will consider the head or the main part of the body, because that's where all the processing, all the thinky is going on. It's going to be going on up inside the head, and where that brain is at, that's where we're going to see that going on. And so another thing to notice is, again, I've said it several times already. What do we smell with? Our nose. What do we taste with? Our mouth, specifically our tongue. What do we see with? Our eyes. And again, how do we hear? It's with our ears. And these are what we call special sense organs. And that's why this group of senses gets that unique name, the special senses. All right? Touch is not generally included in this because, as I said earlier, touch happens all throughout our bodies. We have the majority of those sensors in our hands and our feet, and some surprisingly in our elbows. But for the most part, it kind of happens all throughout the integumentary system. And even within the muscular system, we have neurons to help us sense these types of things. And so touch is its own category. It's just these general senses. So we're not really going to be talking about touch for the remainder of this chapter because we talked about it somewhat in our last two chapters about the brain and the nervous system. Here we're primarily going to be looking at the senses that in order for us to utilize them, we need special organs. And so this brings us to a question, simply, how can we hack these senses? And can we develop new senses? Now again, you guys have seen these thought bubbles before when we have them generally in class. What I want you to do with them here is simply kind of pause for a second, think about this question, jot down a little answer, then you can go ahead and email it to me or post it in the Remind app, and then I want you to move on with this. So how can we hack our senses? All right, first of all, you might be thinking, why would we even want to hack our senses? Well, think about this. Let's say you're blind. You no longer have your sight. All right, let's say you are deaf. You can't hear. Well, how are you going to operate especially when these senses are there to help you survive. All right, if you can't see danger, what's going to happen to you? If you can't hear somebody talking to you or something coming towards you, what's going to happen? And so we've looked at different ways at how we can actually hack into our own system to not only take these senses that we've lost and incorporate them somehow, but even come up with new senses. And so what I want you to do, if you haven't done so already, there's a TED Talk uh, about this exact subject. And what that TED Talk talks about is simply that. Can we create new senses for humans? So up here you'll see the title. Also, this TED Talk will be linked in the description. You'll find that below. But this kind of gives it away what's going on. You can see that there's something strapped to his back. I'm not going to tell you what that is or what that does. You'll have to watch the video to see that. So I want you to go ahead, pause this right now, go to that link, and watch the video. And I'll just wait here. Did you do it yet? Well, I'm going to assume that you paused this video and you went to go watch it. And I hope that you kind of got some understanding of what he was talking about, what he was saying. And he kind of also brought on that idea, you know, where our general senses are and how sometimes our senses are lacking compared to other organisms. Whereas a dog might be able to smell a cat, you know, 100 yards away, we can't. Our senses aren't that adapted. And so he's trying to bring in these different ideas of what if we could not only heighten our own senses, but create new senses. Now, I want you to also keep in mind, what did he talk about? Like, how did he create these new senses? He talked about maybe we can, you know, sense UV radiation, how high the content is. Maybe we can sense different things going on in the markets. That was one of his ideas. And if you noticed, he was using vibrations. And how do we sense vibrations? It's generally going to be through touch. And so what we've done is we've actually hacked those senses that God's already given us to use them for other things. And so as he sees this as some way possibly of, you know, the human race evolving, one way we can generally perceive this is just, you know, we're not really creating anything new, but we're using what God's already given us and we're going to add to it to help us with that. And so, again, it's just some food for thought, something interesting to think about. But now we're actually going to start talking about those main senses that God did give us and what to do with those. So, the first one we're going to be talking about is the eye. We're going to be talking about the structures of the eye today. We're going to be talking about the accessory structures and just the general shape and structure of the eye. And then tomorrow, we're going to be talking about how our body uses this organ, how our body takes these images in, or how it even creates an image, and then our brain is going to process that. That's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. But today we're just going to be going over the basic structure. We're going to be talking about what these things are around the eye first. They're what we call our accessory structures or accessory organs. So the first thing that's kind of obvious is that we have eyelids. We have eyelids and eyelashes. Those are the obvious things. And of course, you know, common sense, what do they help us do? Well, they're going to help protect our eyes. And how do they do that? One thing is, of course, closing our eyes when something comes. But some of the less obvious things is that you can see it talks about in your notes. It's the tarsal glands. What these tarsal glands actually do, you guys can kind of see right here in this picture I have for you guys, all these little dots around this person's eyelid. It's underneath the eyelashes, but all these little dots, those are where these tarsal glands, right now I know tarsal, we generally think of feet, but our tarsal glands, that's generally where we are going to get this sebaceous oil. And sebaceous, you might remember from when we talked about the skin, the sebaceous glands. They were producing that sebum, that oil. Likewise, this is a lubricating oil that helps keep our eyes from drying out. Now, we have other glands that are going to help us do that. We're going to see in a second. But this is the main one that's from the eyelid. And so, again, our eyelids don't just help us with blinking and closing our eyes, but they're going to help us with keeping our eyes from drying out. Likewise, our eyelashes, they're not just there to look pretty, they actually do have a purpose. They're like a filter. And what they're going to do is, again, there's dust particles in the air, there are little specks of things, and occasionally they hit your eye, and that's irritating. But before we even get to that, we have these eyelashes that are going to help us filter these things out. All right? And so again, something gets stuck in the eyelash and it can't go in your eye. That's the whole point of that. All right, the conjunctiva. Now, this conjunctiva is just simply a membrane that kind of covers our eye. It's going to help protect our eye, and just it helps with that tarsal gland, with that oil. It keeps it lubricated. There's going to be some mucus that comes from this, and that's also going to help you from your eye drying out. There's also going to be things that are antibacterial in some sense that are going to help with removing this debris and making sure that infection doesn't occur. Now, sometimes you guys might have had an infection in your eye known as pink eye. And the scientific term for pink eye is simply conjunctivitis. All right, you can kind of see where they get that from the conjunctiva. All right, this conjunctiva is what's going to be infected. Itis just means like a sickness or an illness in Latin. So conjunctivitis, it's an illness, a sickness, a disease of the conjunctiva. And of course what happens is somehow this gets infected, whether it's bacteria or something that just irritates the eye to the point where the conjunctiva is going to build up a lot of gunk. The eye is going to get irritated. That's what that redness is that irritation and that inflammation. And yes, you will get that nasty gunk around the eye. And that's what pink eye is. All right, so that's conjunctiva. Now, what we're going to be moving on to next is what's known as the lacrimal apparatus. This lacrimal apparatus, you have this image here that you can see what's going on. The apparatus is the whole structure. We're going to be talking about each one of these, but including your gland, the sac, the canaliculi, the duct. This entire structure is what we call the apparatus, but we're going to be taking it apart one by one. This structure can also be seen in your coloring sheets that I gave you. The Visual Systems coloring sheet number 2. You'll see this exact, or you'll see another representation of this on your coloring sheet for Visual System number 2. Now, this coloring sheet, some of you guys were wondering, this is not an assignment. Coloring sheet number 2 is not an assignment. I just gave it to you guys as a reference. So you had another reference to go back at for looking at your lacrimal apparatus. All right, so let's go ahead and get our notes on these, what we need to see. So the lacrimal apparatus, again, is the gland consistent with the duct. Now, you probably never heard this term lacrimal gland, lacrimal fluid, or any of these things before, but simply put, this is where our tears come from. This is where we cry from. Whether happy, sad, emotional or not emotional, and whether you realize it or not, you're crying right now. And I don't just mean on the inside. We are physically crying tears, and that's a good thing because it's actually, again, helping keeping our eyes from drying out, from getting those infections, things like that. So this lacrimal gland, again, that's what this lacrimal fluid is that we're talking about. And that lacrimal fluid, again, it starts developing. It's actually above your eye, as you can see right here, to the lateral ends, meaning to the outside of the body, closer to the closer to your ear. That's where you have your lacrimal glands. It's going to release that lacrimal fluid that's going to go down, and it's actually going to flush across your eye. Again, in most cases, this is happening 24/7 nonstop. Your lacrimal glands are producing tears. Those tears will come down to flush out your eye, just to make sure that your eyes are continually moistened, that they're not drying out, and that they're protected. And then generally, unless we're just crying profusely or that this is blocked, there's a little hole right in here where that lacrimal canaliculi, canaliculi being plural, we have these two little tiny canals, and those tiny canals are what are going to be taking that lacrimal fluid down into the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct. Now, this is also why we cry, or why our nose gets runny when we cry, because what's happening is our tears are emptying through our nose. This is also one of those things that keeps that nasal passage uh, from drying out. Why you get those, as gross as it is, why we get those soggy boogers, or I don't know how to say it. But again, that's why our nose doesn't dry out. That lacrimal fluid is coming down. And so if we really start to cry, like say Spider-Man here, getting all upset, maybe we're upset because we're still in quarantine, or because we have to eat whatever mom made instead of getting takeout because, Corona, whatever it may be, whatever we're crying about, you know, uh, that's going to be flushing through. And if we are having an excess of tears and things like that, it's going to start to get all that junk in the nose really gunky. And that's why you get the sniffles when you cry, and why it's just nasty. Now, this also works in reverse. All right, when we have allergies and our noses are naturally just kind of congested, that nasal cavity and that nasolacrimal duct, it gets congested, and so it gets compacted and tight. And so when we start to have these tears, even just our general tears that are going on throughout the day, they can't go down this. And so that's when we get those watery eyes, when we get that excessiveness, and we start to get that nasty gunk that builds up around here. Another really gross fun fact for you. How many of you guys have ever seen those videos where people will be spitting or milk through their eyeballs? This is how they do it. All right, do not try this at home. I'm not suggesting it, so don't say Mr. Ersel said to try this. Do not try this. All right, but again, in general, what's most likely happening is, again, they take the nose, they inhale it through, or they take the milk, they inhale it through their nose, and then they force it up the wrong way, mind you, through the nasolacrimal duct, and it pushes out the eyeball. And so I'll put a nice little link in that in the description for you if you want to watch that video. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But just an FYI, it's really gross. But again, that's how people squirt things through their eyes. It's because they're using this lacrimal duct to do so. All right, so again, our final accessory structures of the eye we're going to be talking about are the extrinsic eye muscles. And what these are, they're just simply the 6 muscles that attach to the outer surface of the eye. And these are what help us produce our eye movement. When you get mad at somebody, or I say a joke and you roll your eyes, it's these 6 muscles that are going to help you do that. So we're going to go through all 6 of these muscles. If you look on the second page of your notes where it says E for intrinsic eye muscles, you're going to see it. There's a little chart there. It's this chart exactly. All right, all I want you to do is go through all 6 of the muscles, and I want you to just simply put what their action is, what they're doing. Now, you can go ahead and pause this here so you can get all these down. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to the next 2 slides, because on the next 2 slides, we're actually going to see some diagrams of these muscles. Now, these same diagrams can also be found on the Visual Structures Coloring Sheet 3. Now, this coloring sheet, you do need to color in and label the eye muscles. That's the only section of the coloring sheet that you need to do. But again, the Visual Structures number 3 coloring sheet, where you see all 6 of these eye muscles, you're going to have to color those, and that's it on that worksheet. It's only a 5-point coloring sheet because you're just doing half of it, but you do need to color those. So let's go ahead and we're going to look at each one of these, and I'm going to explain how they move them. All right, so first of all, what we're looking at is the right eye. This is the eye in somebody's right ocular socket. First and foremost, we can see here the lateral rectus muscle. Again, pulling back from what we've already talked about, our naming of muscles, the lateral rectus muscle, this is a straight muscle, that's what rectus means, on the lateral side. Again, what does lateral mean? Remember, it's away from the midline, so this is closer to the ear. The fact that this is the lateral rectus meaning that this is the muscle that's closest to the ear and not to the nose, lets us know that this is the right eye. And so your lateral rectus muscle, this is what moves the eye laterally. In other words, again, this is our right eyeball. When you look to your right without moving your face or your head or anything, looking to the right, this muscle is going to contract. When that muscle contracts, it pulls back, pulling our eyeball to the right. All right, this muscle right here, it's number 5 on your little chart there. It's the inferior oblique. Now, your oblique muscles are going to be pulling them a little bit differently. Generally, we can see these and we can see that if it's inferior, like this inferior rectus, it's going to be pulling the eye down. Remember, inferior is below. So if you have the inferior rectus, that's going to pull the eye down. But the inferior oblique muscle is actually going to be doing a twisting motion. That's what that oblique is referring to. So there's a twisting motion that's going on. And the way it twists it is it's attached inferiorly, but it's actually going to pull your gaze up and laterally. So again, what's going to happen is that muscle is going to contract, and you're going to kind of be looking out of the right top corner of your eye when you use this muscle. Likewise, we have our superior oblique muscle. Again, superior being at the top, but it's oblique. So it's not necessarily going to, when it contracts, it's not going to help us tilt our eyes up. It's actually going to help us tilt our eyes down and towards the midline. I'm sorry, out laterally again. So this one is when you're looking down to the right. All right. And then last but not least, the last muscle that we're going to see on here is the superior rectus muscle. And again, just look at these structures. Look at the way the muscles are attached to the eye, and you can see that when this one contracts, in other words, when it pulls, chain reaction happens. This eye is then going to get tilted up because here's where our little tendon is at. And when that tendon gets pulled, it pushes the eye up. And so those are the main muscles. So let's go ahead and let's take a superior view. If we were to do what's called a coronal cut, all right, a coronal cut just means that we're kind of doing one of those horizontal cuts, but from the surface where the head is at. If we're looking down at our eye now, we can see right here is the superior rectus muscle. Again, when this gets pulled, it's going to shoot our eyeball up. Right below here, deep to that, or inferior to it, is the inferior rectus muscle. When this one gets pulled or contracted, it's going to pull the eye down. Likewise, you can see your lateral rectus muscle. All right, that lateral rectus is going to turn the eye laterally so you can look to the right. And here's one we didn't see, or at least I didn't talk about on the other slide, is our medial rectus muscle. Now, when this muscle gets pulled, it's going to pull that eye towards the midline. In other words, towards your nose. So if you're trying to kind of look at your nose, which if you look hard enough, you can see, you'll be able to use that medial rectus muscle to do so. Just go back. So here again, it's not labeled, but this muscle right here that I'm moving the mouse over, that is the medial rectus muscle. So when that muscle contracts, this eyeball is going to be looking at his nose. All right, and this is just, again, if you didn't get these notes earlier, you can pause it here, but we're going to be moving on. So now we're going to be talking about the structure of the eye itself. Now this structure itself, even anatomy, we refer to it as the eyeball. The eyeball is just the structure of it. There are different layers to the eyeball. As you can see, we have the sclera. The sclera and what's known as the cornea are going to make up what's known as the fibrous layer together. We have our fibrous layer, then we have the choroid, which is this kind of pigmented muscular layer, or at least it's going to have some muscles in it. And then last but not least, we have the retina. We're going to look at what the retina is made of, but how it works, we're going to see that tomorrow. All right, so this is just another diagram showing you what we're going to be looking at. Here you can see again that fibrous layer, the choroid, and then the retina is that really fine layer. This is an actual eye, so you can see what it actually looks like. We're also going to learn how the eyeball keeps its shape. It's filled with all these what we call humors, which are just different fluids, and we're going to be looking at that tomorrow. So first of all, looking at the fibrous layer, we have our sclera and the cornea. If you've ever heard the term or the phrase, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. That was an old phrase from the Revolutionary War. This is what we refer to as the white of somebody's eye. Now we have the iris, which is that colored layer, but that white part of the eyeball, that's the sclera. And it's that sclera is just a type of connective tissue that it's a covering. It connects and protects the eye. This is where all those 6 muscles that we just talked about, they're going to be attached to this layer. All right, and then our cornea. Now the cornea, it's this clear covering. It's kind of like a contact you could think of. Right here, it's a little bit hard to see on this real eye, but here we can see it a little bit better. Now here it looks opaque, meaning it's foggy, but on our eyeballs, it's clearly not foggy. We need to be able to see through it, and so it's a clear structure that helps protect our eyeball. It's going to help protect the lens and our iris, what's helping us actually see and project our image. It's very important. With that being said, it's also the front line that's going to be damaged a lot. It's that main portion. And so there's actually lots of nerve fibers in there that are connected to it that make it really sensitive. And again, this is important because that's what's protecting your eye. And so it's going to have these nerve fibers to help you sense when things are on your eye. That way your eye can either flush it out with blinking, or if you have to flush it out with just water. Nonetheless, it's sensitive for that reason. It can get scratched fairly easily, but again, because it's so important and it's protecting our eye and helping us see, it repairs itself easily. And just another kind of fun fact, I guess you could say, this is the only human tissue that actually can be transplanted and has been transplanted without fear of rejection. Now, why might it be because of that? Simply put, again, going back to our cornea, and again, it's hard to see here, but throughout the sclera and everywhere else, we do have blood vessels. If you just look at your eye in the mirror long enough and you look at your sclera, you're going to see those blood vessels. But you're also going to notice that to a certain extent, they stop on the sclera. You do not have any blood vessels in your cornea. And that's what makes it so unique in our ability to transplant it without fear of rejection. Because the fact that the cornea doesn't have any blood vessels, there's no blood that's going to get to it. Why is that important for transplants? It's because of our antibodies and these different things. In other words, if we have a heart that we're trying to transplant, if it comes from somebody who has a different blood type, or just even if it's the same blood type, there might be some structures, some microscopic things on that heart that are going to be a little bit different than what our body's used to, and it might actually attack it. Our immune system would attack it. Because again, what's going on with the blood, what's in the blood. Whereas the cornea is not going to have any blood, it's not going to get that, and so you're not going to see any attack from that. And so that's why we can transplant it without that. All right, so again, moving on, now we're going to be looking at the next layer, which is this choroid layer. Again, this is not in your notes, but for the iris and the pupil, so notes C and D, go ahead and write somewhere on your notes that this is the choroid layer. All right, your iris and your pupil together make up part of this layer. Now the pupil itself we're going to talk about really isn't anything but just an opening, but nonetheless, when we're talking about the pupil and the iris, we consider that part of the choroid layer in this ciliary zone. All right, so the iris is just, that's the part that we think of when we think about our eyes being colored. What color eyes do you have? We're talking about the iris. And this iris, if you look really closely, it's actually a type of muscle. Uh, all these lines and everything are these muscles that are going to be contracting, or we would consider it dilating. They're going to open and close. And as this muscle either expands, allowing this pupil to get larger, or contracts to make it get smaller, it's going to allow more light in. And that's what this pupil is. This pupil is just simply the opening in the iris that's going to allow for that light to pass through. All right. And so what's happening is, let's say we're in a room that is really bright. This pupil is going to close because we don't want that much light coming in. But if we're in a room that's really dark, then this pupil is going to get really large. In other words, this muscle is going to relax and it's going to allow more light in. That way we can try and process what we're seeing. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow when we talk about how our eyes are actually working. But nonetheless, that's what's going on here. And it's that muscular layer of the choroid. All right, and then last but not least, what we're going to be talking about today, this is our last slide, so you can be thankful that, we're not going any longer. It's the retina. This retina is the final layer of our eye, and this is what's doing all the processing. You can think of this almost as the projector screen, because that's what this is in our eye. It's what the image is being projected on. And then these little cells that we have called rods and cones are going to be taking all these this image, and it's going to be sending it to the brain so we can process it and figure out what is going on. These rods and cones are what help us to receive these pictures and process them, and so they're called photoreceptors. Again, let's break apart our Latin. Photo is referring to light. Receptor, it's receiving it. So it's receiving these lights, these cells, and they're going to process them and help us make a picture. Our rods are going to help us with our peripheral vision, in other words, what we see to our sides, or dim lighting. It's also going to help us with our shapes, and for the most part, that's what's actually going to be helping us see. But if we want a good color picture, we're going to be relying on our cones. And this is super easy to remember. All you have to remember is, what does color start with? A C. What does cone start with? A C. So to remember which one helps us with color vision, it starts with a C, it's the cone. All right? And so we'll pick up here tomorrow and we'll talk about what happens when, let's say, these cones aren't working right, or even sometimes the rods aren't working right. What's going to happen? How do we mess up this vision? And how does that vision actually even happen? So what we talked about today were just the different structures of the eye, the different external structures, the apparatuses that help with us, with help with seeing, with help protecting the eye. And tomorrow we're actually going to be looking at how we actually make an image. One final thing I want you guys to write down, these rods and cones. They are types of neurons, and if you remember, we talked about the different types of neurons. These are what we call our bipolar neurons. Remember, they're going to have two different extensions coming off the cell body, and all these little dots right there, those are our cell bodies. And as you can clearly see, the ones that look like cones, those are the cones. The ones that look like rods are the rods. Tomorrow, we're going to look at how these work together to make a picture. If you were able to stay with me this long and you have not fallen asleep, thank you very much. If you have any questions about what you see here, or you're just curious about something, I would love to hear your feedback because I miss hearing it. We're not in class right now, and so I don't get you guys having your questions like, well, what about when this happens? What about when that happens? And if you have those questions, please share them. Please share them in the comments. That way your other classmates can see it and we can respond to them, or I can do a video response to it. I hope this helped you. If you would like me to do it some other way, also maybe mention that in the comments. But yeah, just go ahead. I hope this helped you today. Hope helped you understand what your notes were, what these slides meant. And if you have any other questions, just leave them in the comments, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.